Okay. Thank you very much, and welcome to Broadway Buzz. Are you in for a surprise tonight? This is Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. Now let me start by telling you a little fractured fairy tale. Once upon a time, long ago, in the last millennium, that's 1970, and far away, that's Australia, there lived a beautiful princess. Well, she wasn't exactly a princess, she was a middle-aged transsexual. And she had two very dear friends who had the penchant for cross-dressing. And like Judy Garland and Mickey, they wanted to present a sweet little show, so they bought a bus and named it Priscilla, and they took their act on the road. Now, they drove across Australia through absolutely incredible territory. It's the butchest part of the show. And they ended up in Alice Springs, where, like Mickey and Judy, they presented their little show. But unlike Mickey and Judy, they didn't use a barn and they didn't present a sweet little musical. Instead, they went to a sleazy disco at the end of the world and presented a raunchy drag show. Everyone lived happily ever after. That basically is the story of Priscilla, but it is definitely not a drag. It's one of the funniest, most delightful, in-your-face musicals. So if you have a sensitivity button and you're easily offended, disconnect it, because it's worth it. What happens in the show is funny, sassy, bawdy, but under it there is, under all those sequins and all those furs and all those feathers, there is a heart of gold. In fact, it's a lovely little family story once you filter through all of the costumes, and you realize it's really about a young boy being reconnected with his father. What's strange about it, of course, is his father is wearing a mini skirt and high heels and eyelashes that are 3 inches long. But we very soon adjust to all of this, as we do in all fairy tales. Okay, let me go back and just say that this is a sassy, delightful show. It's highly innovative. The staging is spectacular. There are over 500 costumes, and there are even better legs than Radio City Music Hall. Now, let's go back to the origin of Priscilla. Like all great stories, we have to trace back its ancestry. It all started, really, in the late 1980s, and we're talking about what was happening in the film industry in Australia. At this period, there was a lot of government support and a tremendous insurgence of wonderful creativity started happening, especially in Australian cinema. And there was a young man who was very interested in being a writer and director. His name is Stephen Elliott. And he had this idea to create a movie, a sort of adventure movie, an on-the-road movie about a transsexual crossing the outback and with two friends and presenting ultimately a drag show. And so this was his idea. He would ultimately name it, of course, The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. But to sell a new movie like this was very difficult. So now we're in 1993. He came out of that period of tremendous excitement in this cinema that was very cutting edge, doing very quirky, wonderful pieces. And the end result was Stephen Elliott had created a movie that was accepted at the Cannes Film Festival in 1993. It was called Fraud. And so he was hoping this would be his introduction to world cinema and that he would be discovered with this film. And he also had in his pocket the new film, Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, that he hoped that if his first movie was very successful, he could immediately find backing and support for this very ambiguous and very difficult show to sell, the movie of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. Well, when they got to the Cannes Film Festival, all of the critics sort of did a thumbs down to his movie called Fraud, and he was very distraught. So it was going to make it even more difficult to try and find backing for this very unusual storyline for movie. So what he did was, very smartly, he hired several drag queens to go to all of the cocktail parties. But at first this didn't work because they couldn't separate the young starlets from the drag queens. So the end result was that he didn't make a very big initial impression. But lo and behold, finally he was smart enough to start speaking to the right people, and people started saying that's a quirky enough idea that if you find the right star for the movie, maybe it might work. And so he very quickly said, oh, I have Tony Curtis in the bag. And he, of course, had done that wonderful film in drag with Jack Lemmon, Some Like It Hot. And so the end result was, people said, oh, that's very interesting. Yes, you have, keep me posted about your show. Well, lo and behold, Tony Curtis turned them down flat. And that by the end of the festival, they really had no one. They had some interest. But I just want you to be aware of how difficult it is for an independent film to make it. Happily, he had a wonderful producer, a film producer, named Al Clark. And Al Clark was smart enough to know that they wanted to do this movie so that they could use disco music, and they would have the characters in the show lip sync as drag artists did in that period. And so the end result was they started getting a list of very important songs from the disco era. It's, of course, very rich in music. And the end result was they started getting record companies interested in producing the movie. Well, lo and behold, they finally got all the pieces together. This took almost a year. And now we are approaching the new Cannes Film Festival. And at the last moment, in a sort of desperate effort to find someone to play the lead, that is the sort of middle-aged transsexual, they talked the great film actor Terence Stamp into playing the role. And of course, Terence Stamp had always played very masculine roles, and he was a leading man in many films and a very, very first-rate actor. But he thought this might be a wonderful midlife challenge for him. And so he agreed to play the role. Well, of course, that was pure gold. And what resulted was this incredibly innovative, wonderful, funny, sassy, delightful, off-the-wall film that was potentially looking for its market. So again, they applied at the Cannes Film Festival, and once again, the film was accepted. But this time, the very smart producer, Al Gould, said, we're not going to just play it in the regular film festival and the regular daytime showings. We're going to play it at midnight, which was, of course, a very smart thing to do. And very early on, Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, took off at the Cannes Film Festival. And when you can't get a ticket, that means that everyone wants to see it. So this is very smart promotion. Keep in mind, they're still trying to pay the bills of making the movie. And the end result is, at the end of the Cannes Film Festival, it won the People's Award, which means it was the most popular film at the Cannes Film Festival. So this ensured its life. And then again, very smartly, the producer took the show and started playing it at film festivals, but he was very selective about where he played it. He played it in San Francisco with a large gay audience. He played it in Los Angeles with a large gay audience. He played it in Rio with a large gay audience. And the end result was that word of mouth spread about Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, and what no one realized is that it wasn't only going to be a show that was geared for a very special audience, obviously the gay audience. They realized that everyone liked this show, young, old, everyone seemed to relate to the really true story in the show, a story of the need to be loved, and the story of the need for tolerance. And it really became a cult film, and it remained so. So after it played at the Cannes Film Festival in 1994, it then literally played all over the world, and it had a very long life as a very important sort of cult film. As you remember, Muriel's Wedding, another great Australian movie, would come out at this time. And to talk about coincidence, in America at the same time in 1994, just as they were about to present Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, to an American audience, another American film came out about three drag queens crossing America. It was called To Wong Fu, with Regards, from Julie Newmar. And that movie was a success, but Priscilla eclipsed it. and it was an extraordinary success. So it took its place in terms of cult films as one of the great sort of underground films that found a popular audience. Now, if you're interested in filmmaking, there's an extraordinary book that Al Clark, the producer, wrote, and it's called, ironically, Making Priscilla. And it's a very funny sort of behind-the-camera account of what it took to literally move this cast and these buses across Australia. And keep in mind, Australia, in many ways, I mean, they love sports, they love the outdoors, and they're not accustomed to seeing drag queens climbing Ayers Rock. So this was an extraordinary experience. Just a funny story about that. There's a wonderful sequence in the movie where they do climb Ayers Rock, and they had to go to the Aboriginal people who own the rock, and they said, we would like to film there. And they said, well, we have very specific rules. Men are allowed in one part of the rock, women are allowed in another part of the rock. And the producer said, well, this is sort of a problem because we have men dressed as women climbing the rock, so how are we going to handle that? But one of the things I want you to be aware of as you watch the movie, I mean, the musical follows the spirit of the movie. It would be wonderful for you after you see the musical to go back and see that movie. It's on Netflix, very easily available. But one of the things I want to tell you that made that movie so extraordinary was the notion, the brilliance of putting drag queens in the middle of a desert, putting them on Ayers Rock, putting them in this environment that absolutely looks like you're on the moon, these sort of lunar environments. And then to see all these creatures in sequins and feathers and makeup, the juxtaposition is extraordinary. I mean, I think of a couple of great movies. I mean, how can we ever forget Julie Andrews in The Sound of Music when she opened her arms and she had all of the Alps behind her and she was singing, that idea of one person with this vast environment around them. Or you think of Peter O'Toole in Lawrence of Arabia when he stood on top of those trains with all his robes blowing. I mean, that visual of man in nature, or Julie Andrews in nature. And then, of course, that's the same major visual that happens in the movie that becomes so memorable, that becomes indelible, that you're really struck by the juxtaposition of the absurdity of these outrageous, over-the-top costumes and then the stark environment. The musical catches those qualities brilliantly, and the musical in many ways is as filmic and as visual as the movie was. Okay, so we know that all of that happened in 1994. Priscilla went on to fluff her feathers all over the world, and it was a great success. Okay, so here we are now. We're now 2005, and we're back in Sydney, Australia, and there's a young director named Simon Phillips. And Simon Phillips was the artistic director of the Melbourne Theatre Company. I'd like you to be aware that if you do have the opportunity of traveling and of going to Australia, some of the greatest theater companies right now exist there. Kate Blanchett, for example, and her husband have a theater company in Sydney called the Sydney Theatre Company, and it's world famous now. They have taken their productions literally all over the world. The most sought-after ticket in New York was the Sydney Theatre Festival's production starring Kate Blanchett of Streetcar Named Desire and Hedda Gabler. So, I mean, they're extraordinary theaters that in the tradition of the great English theaters have wonderful actors and very skilled directors. Same thing is true in Melbourne, in Auckland, and a whole range of cities all through Australia. So it is not a wasteland by any means, and it's highly developed in terms of its art. But in any case, this young director from the Melbourne Theatre Company had the idea of turning Priscilla into a musical. And so he worked with Stephen Elliott, the original director and writer of the movie. And Stephen Elliott thought it was a very bad idea and saw no way of translating the movie into a musical. So he concocted a story that was sort of a play within a play. And what the story was that he proposed as a musical, the original writer, was that actors were rehearsing a musical of the film of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. And the actors then had to be worried about playing the actor, playing the character in the movie, in the musical. And it got so confusing. They had a workshop, And after the first reading, all of the actors were in tears because no one could figure out anything that was going on. And Stephen Elliott stood up and said, "I told you this was a terrible idea," and he flew out. And they thought that was the end of Priscilla the musical. But lo and behold, the director was very smart, and he said, "I've hired you all for a month for workshops, so we're going to continue, but we're throwing this script out. We're going to go back to the movie script of Priscilla. We'll improvise scenes from the movie, and what we have to do is find appropriate songs to put in the musical." And they sort of did that in this month period, and what they came up with was something really extraordinary. And so the original writer came back and said, "I knew this was a great idea," and took over the project again. But it was that fragile and that close to literally being destroyed. And so subsequently, that show was developed over almost a year, and in 2006, it opened in Sydney. Now, keep in mind, in America, we have this notion that musicals either come from America or from England. But what we have to realize now is the musical as an art form belongs to the world. Germany is creating interesting things. There are projects in South America that are extraordinarily interesting. And in the case of Australia, they have The Boy from Oz, which transferred to London and New York, starred Hugh Jackman in New York. And then they were developing Priscilla. Well, Priscilla opened after a great deal of difficulty. The famous bus of the story kept dying, and they could never get a run-through of the show because they could never get the bus to work. And so the end result was it was a catastrophic rehearsal period. The word of mouth in Sydney was, "No wonder Australians don't do musicals," but lo and behold, magically, everything came together at the end. The show opened triumphantly in Sydney. It ultimately played for 2 years, from 2006 to 2008, in Sydney and Auckland, in Melbourne. It traveled all through Australia. It also then moved to New Zealand. And then there was very strong interest in taking it to London. So in 2009, the show opened in London to rave reviews. It subsequently played in London for 2 years. And this would then establish Priscilla as the largest grossing Australian musical. It's played to over 1 million people, and it's had now an enormous world success. So after it was playing in London, everyone started saying, well, the next move, of course, is New York. But New York really couldn't come up with the money for it. Number one, they thought it was a little edgy, a little feisty. They weren't certain that it had a commercial market for it, even though we had had 6 other drag shows like La Cage aux Folles and a large number of other successful musicals dealing with cross-dressing. And the end result was that they couldn't quite get the money. So they decided, smartly, to create a new North American production in Toronto. So it opened in Toronto in 2010 and was an enormous success. And the company, and what they also did in Toronto was they reconfigured it visually. So they hired a new set designer, a new lighting designer. They kept the original costume designers who had won an Academy Award for the best costumes of the year that year and had also won the major Olivier Awards in London for the brilliant costumes that were in the show. But they reimagined the show visually for its Toronto run. And that was very smart because they made it ultimately very sophisticated, very edgy, very visually delightful. You're going to be dazzled by the visuals in the show. Okay, so the end result was that it opened in Toronto, but they still didn't have all the money they needed for New York. Enter Bette Midler. Bette Midler loved the show. She supported the show in London. She was responsible for helping it move to Toronto. And finally, they put her name as the lead producer of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. It's sort of the story of her life. And the end result was that it found the investors it needed. It moved to New York in 2011, had a very distinguished run. It then opened in Milan. It's just opened in Brazil. And the national tour has just started. It's played in 1 city, so we're the 2nd city to have it. It's coming from Milwaukee. So the end result is that it's a show that's enormously popular and delightful. Let me go to some of the roots of the show that influence this story and make it so delightful. Number one, it is, of course, now a jukebox musical. And you understand that that means you take music and put it together, pre-existing music, music that had been successful. And in this case, they went to disco music. And of course, the world of disco music in the 70s was extraordinary. So the end result was they have a long tradition now of successful jukebox musicals. We love Jersey Boys, we love Mamma Mia, etc. We love Come Fly With Me. So the end result was it was going to be in the genre of a jukebox musical. There's been an opportunity for the producers to see how that works. And so the end result was they followed in that tradition. They would develop a storyline like they did in Mamma Mia and tell a story based on the music. Ironically, when you watch the show, you feel that the music is so perfectly suited for the show and so right for the characters. It moves the storyline forward. It adds all the levels of emotional dimension to the musical. It adds spectacle. It does all the things songs in a great musical should do. So it followed that formula of the jukebox musical. Then let me talk about some other traditions that it followed. Number one, the obvious thing is, of course, drag. The word drag, D-R-A-G, really started in the 19th century. And either they have two etymologies for the word. Either they said when people cross-dressed on the stage, the actors wearing the gowns, as they did in English pantomimes, for example, would always drag them on the ground. So therefore, they didn't know how to wear dresses the way women did. And that was part of the fun of it, to make fun of the way the man wore the dress. And so dragging it on the ground, therefore, that may be the origin of the word drag. But others say that dr means dress, D-R-A, as G, a girl, dressed as a girl. And at the same time, they developed another word called drab, meaning dressed as a boy, when the cross-dressing worked the other way. So that became popular, ironically, in entertainments. Again, if we just pause for a minute, the notion of drag is really ancient. I mean, it goes all the way back to Greek satyr plays. And even in the Greek chorus, all of the women's roles were played by men. And so there was cross-dressing in that regard even then. There are whole tribal references to cross-dressing. Keep in mind, the American Indians honored a sort of androgynous people who appeared to be neither masculine nor feminine, and they very often wore feminine clothes as part of the Indian tribe, but they were considered to be healers. They were considered to have special powers. In India, the country of India, we see examples of it with the Hydra, the eunuch who would perform at christenings, at weddings. It's a sign of good luck to see someone cross-dressing. So there's a very ancient tradition about cross-dressing, and there's an ancient tradition in the theater. We see it in the Chinese classical theater, in the Japanese classical theater. We see it in the English pantomime. We see it in the American vaudeville. We see it on television, Flip Wilson, etc. We have a lot of great drag personalities like Dame Edna, etc. So the end result is it's been in our culture since the beginning of time. In almost every culture, I was just reading in this book that's really quite extraordinary called The Changing Room about ancient tribes in Papua New Guinea and how cross-dressing had always been a part of the culture. So it's been in our culture. Nothing is new. Old things are reworked, of course. And so the end result is the tradition of drag has worked in the theater. Shakespeare used it, of course. There was always cross-dressing. Sometimes Shakespeare would get very convoluted with it, where a man would be playing a woman who was playing a man, as in the case of As You Like It, so that we're really going through 3 layers of reality before the idea works itself out. So the end result is right up to modern times and right up to television and right up to Modern Family, we have examples of people doing some form of cross-dressing. So drag would be a very important part of this. Also, another very important part of the humor of this show is camp. Susan Sontag in 1964 wrote a brilliant book called Notes on Camp, C-A-M-P, when she talked about the notion that we laugh at things that are absolutely outrageous, that are absolutely overstated. And very often, you know, when camp humor now is very closely associated with drag humor. And of course, when you see some of the drags with, you know, wigs that are 3 feet high and dresses that are 4 feet wide, you understand that the excessive exaggeration, the outrageous exaggeration, is very much part of the show. We have large numbers of drag icons. I mean, whether it's Cher or whether it's, I don't mean drag, I'm sorry, I mean camp icons. Oh, that was a slip of the tongue. But in any case, the camp icons also, Bette Midler, even Liberace was a kind of camp icon. And if any of you watched the Golden Globes the other night, when Sylvester Stallone came out in that dinner jacket where his shoulder pads were wider than anything Joan Crawford ever wore, but his eyebrows were more plucked than Joan Crawford, we think either this is camp or drag. I'm not sure what you call this. But in any case, it's in our culture all the time, and we see it all around us. But that humor is very important to the humor that you see in the show. And therefore, you do have to relax a little bit. Sometimes it's a very in-your-face humor. But what happens is, as you get to know these characters and you understand who they are or what they're going through, you then start relating very strongly to the show. It's an amazing piece in terms of how it pieces together all of these ideas. Okay, so we have the idea that it's influenced by the jukebox musical, it's influenced by drag, it's influenced by camp. And the end result is that we have a show that's a very eclectic show. The big word here really is disco. And if you remember in the 70s, disco was the great dance music. And it based itself on Latin music, on African American music, on funk, and there was this very heavy rhythm going on. And you know, you have to keep a seatbelt on in your seat so you don't find yourself dancing in the aisle. It's an amazing kind of music. And they made perfect choices in the disco songs that they used in the show. And they become, it not only gives you a very strong sense of time and place. Some of you remember, of course, the great disco temples like Studio 54. I mean, what was as famous as Studio 54 was the fact that Andy Warhol, you know, was boogieing with Liza Minnelli, et cetera, and that whole world of the dance world of the disco of the 70s is wonderfully manifested in this show. Watch the characters that are created in the show called the divas. I mean, they out-diva Donna Summers and any of the great divas from that period. It's extraordinary. And the kind of wonderful singing that they do, the very rangy singing that happened in disco. And it's such a contagious music. And so what happens to you in this show is you sort of let your guard down and you start to realize that this show really is about tolerance and this show really is about understanding. I do have to warn you, there is a sequence in the show with ping pong balls, and you'll never be able to watch ping pong at the Olympics again, I promise you. But if you have any sons or grandsons who had bachelor parties, they could tell you all about this. But in any case, don't be shocked. It's a delightful moment in the show. So in any case, what I have finally to say to you is that Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, is not a drag. It is an absolutely delightful and sometimes very touching show. So enjoy. Thank you very much. Thank you.